Max Verstappen escaped an FIA investigation at exactly 11,026 on Saturday morning, clearing a procedural breach for stopping before safety car line 1 just hours before McLaren stole pole position from George Russell in Zandvoort. The stewards had 5 drivers under the microscope for failing to reach the grid under their own power ahead of the sprint, yet every single one of them walked away without a penalty while the championship battle shifted dramatically in the afternoon session. But here is the tension that still hangs over this entire weekend. Why did the governing body wave through a clear technical breach involving half the field, only for the competitive balance to completely collapse on track later that same day? We know the verdict was lenient, and we know the qualifying result was brutal for Red Bull, but the connection between surviving the stewards' room and losing the front row remains the unanswered question defining this Dutch Grand Prix weekend. The official clock shows Yuki Tsunoda's car was first flagged at 11,034 with Verstappen following 14 seconds later and Lewis Hamilton at 11,034,056, illustrating a chaotic window where multiple cars stopped short of the mandatory line. Race director Rui Marquez had issued item 24 in the event notes requiring drivers to proceed to the grid under their own power past safety car line 1, and technically all 5 breached Article 12. 2-1, I of the International Sporting Code by stopping early. Yet the outcome defied the usual zero-tolerance approach to procedural infringements. Stewards cleared, no penalties issued, results stood. This wasn't a reversal of the rule itself, but rather a specific application of discretion based on physical constraints unique to this circuit. Zandvoort's narrow pit, straight and high-banked layout created a bottleneck that made compliance nearly impossible when multiple cars arrived simultaneously, forcing officials to weigh safety over strict adherence to the note. So, where does that leave us regarding the integrity of the enforcement? The stewards' official verdict document, quoted independently by Racing News 36.5 and GP Fans, stated explicitly that as the end of the grid was extremely crowded when the car reached the grid, they determined the driver acted appropriately and stopped the car in a safe spot as close as possible to the grid. That phrasing is critical because it shifts the narrative from willful non-compliance to necessary risk management. Verstappen retained his P6 sprint finish and Hamilton kept P7, meaning no championship points changed hands due to the investigation. But notice what is missing from the record. Despite extensive reporting on the verdict itself, there is no verbatim on-record reaction from Verstappen specifically addressing his clearance. While media outlets framed this as an escape, the silence from the driver himself means we are interpreting relief through procedural documents rather than personal confirmation. This distinction matters because it separates confirmed regulatory outcomes from assumed emotional responses, keeping the focus strictly on what the FIA actually wrote versus what the paddock whispered. Let's be precise about who was actually involved, because early reports blurred important lines. GP Blog accurately headlined that Verstappen was among half the F1 grid facing investigation, correctly identifying the 5 drivers as Verstappen, Hamilton, Bottas, Stroll, and Tsunoda. However, Carlos Sainz was also summoned that same session for a completely separate infringement involving driving unnecessarily slowly to manage his outlap delta before turn 13. Some initial coverage mistakenly grouped him with the grid stop investigation, but Planet F1 clarified his case was unrelated to safety car line 1 compliance. Conflating these 2 distinct breaches would misrepresent both the scope of the grid investigation and the nature of Sainz's warning. Keeping them separate preserves the accuracy of why 5 drivers were cleared for congestion while 1 received a warning for pace management. The telemetry data logged at 11,026 for Verstappen's car tells only part of the story, because the FIA's automated detection system doesn't capture the human decision-making happening inside the cockpit during that critical window. Drivers weren't passively waiting for instructions, they were actively assessing risk in real time as brake lights illuminated ahead and marshals signaled confusion. The 14-second gap between Tsunoda's initial flag and Verstappen's represents 30-plus car lengths of stationary metal on a narrow pit straight where runoff space is measured in centimeters, not meters. Hamilton's subsequent flag at 11,034,056 confirms the congestion was still worsening even as officials began processing earlier breaches, meaning each driver faced progressively worse conditions than the last. This cascading effect is why stewards later emphasized extreme crowding in their verdict, since no amount of pre-session briefing could prepare 5 competitors for a bottleneck that formed organically through accumulated delay. What distinguishes this investigation from typical procedural reviews is the complete absence of competitive advantage in any driver's actions. Stopping before safety car line 1 didn't improve grid position, reduce tire wear, or provide strategic benefit, it merely prevented rear-end collisions in a confined space. Article 12. I exists to maintain orderly formation, not to create artificial penalties when order becomes physically impossible. The steward's recognition of this distinction reflects mature regulatory application rather than favoritism toward high-profile names. Bottas, Stroll, and Tsunoda received identical clearance despite having far less championship relevance than Verstappen or Hamilton, proving the decision was circumstance-driven rather than status-driven. Such consistency across the field reinforces that discretion was applied uniformly based on shared constraints, not selective leniency. Safety prioritized, procedure adapted, field cleared. That three-word sequence captures the operational reality better than any legalistic explanation could. Zandvoort's unique geometry turned a standard grid instruction into an unenforceable mandate the moment multiple cars arrived within seconds of each other. Race director Rui Marquez's Item 24 assumed sufficient spacing for compliance, but the physical infrastructure couldn't support that assumption under compressed timing. Stewards had to choose between punishing unavoidable circumstances or acknowledging systemic limitation, and they chose the latter. Their verdict documents specific language about stopping in a safe spot as close as possible to the grid confirms officials understood that forcing forward movement would have created greater danger than the breach itself. This isn't regulatory weakness, it's intelligent enforcement calibrated to actual conditions rather than theoretical ideals. So how should teams adjust their preparation for future events at similarly constrained venues? The answer lies in recognizing that event notes are starting points, not absolute guarantees. Pre-session simulations must now account for worst-case congestion scenarios where compliance becomes geometrically impossible regardless of driver intent. Teams can't rely solely on FIA discretion to resolve systemic issues. They need contingency protocols for when official instructions collide with physical reality. The fact that 4 different organizations triggered identical breaches simultaneously proves this wasn't about individual error, but about inadequate procedural design for Zandvoort-specific challenges. Until regulations evolve to match circuit constraints, every sprint weekend at tight tracks will carry the same latent risk of mass non-compliance, followed by inevitable clearance based on safety considerations rather than competitive fairness. The official verdict document released by the FIA stewards on August 22, 2026, serves as the definitive legal record for why no sanctions were applied to Verstappen, Hamilton, Bottas, Stroll, or Tsunoda. Racing News 365 and GPN fans both independently verified the exact wording used in that decision, which centered entirely on the phrase that the driver acted appropriately given the conditions. This specific terminology is significant because it transforms what would normally be a strict liability offense into a justified safety measure. In typical proceedings under Article 12I of the International Sporting Code, failing to follow a race director instruction results in an automatic penalty regardless of intent, but here the stewards explicitly overrode that precedent based on environmental factors. They did not say the rule was wrong, nor did they claim the drivers followed it. They simply ruled that adherence was secondary to preventing chaos in a confined space. Grid locked tight, no safe path, compliance impossible. Those 3 realities formed the basis of every single clearance issued that morning. The verdict regarding Car 3 specifically noted that Verstappen stopped before reaching safety car line 1 and therefore did not reach the grid under its own power, yet immediately followed that factual finding with the determination that he acted appropriately. Planet F1 confirmed this dual structure of the ruling, showing that the breach was acknowledged factually even as it was excused procedurally. This nuance prevents future teams from claiming the rule no longer exists, while simultaneously protecting drivers who face identical bottlenecks. It establishes a precedent where physical impossibility can override administrative mandates, but only when documented congestion makes compliance genuinely unachievable rather than merely inconvenient. Can you imagine the alternative scenario if the stewards had chosen strict enforcement over pragmatic safety? Penalizing 5 drivers for a bottleneck they could not control would have artificially reshuffled the sprint results and potentially altered championship standings based on infrastructure limitations rather than racing merit. Verstappen's P6 finish and Hamilton's P7 result remained valid precisely because the stewards recognized that punishing them would have been punitive without being corrective. The discretion embedded in the FIA International Sporting Code exists for exactly these moments, allowing officials to distinguish between willful defiance and necessary adaptation. By clearing all 5 drivers uniformly, the panel reinforced that their authority serves the sport's integrity rather than blind bureaucratic adherence. Let us recap the core regulatory outcome before moving forward. All 5 investigated drivers retained their original sprint finishing positions and points after the stewards determined that extreme grid congestion made stopping before safety car line 1 the appropriate course of action. This resolution closed the procedural chapter completely before main qualifying began later that afternoon. There were no appeals filed, no further hearings scheduled, and no lingering uncertainty about eligibility for Sunday's race. The investigation opened and closed within the same session window, demonstrating efficient stewarding despite the complexity of evaluating 5 separate incidents arising from one shared circumstance. Every source consulted confirms this finality, with no outlet reporting any subsequent challenge to the verdict or any indication that the decision remains open to review. What makes this particular application of discretion especially noteworthy is its consistency across competitors of vastly different championship stature. Bottas driving for Cadillac and Stroll in the Aston Martin received identical treatment to Verstappen and Hamilton, proving the assessment was purely situational rather than political. Had only the title contenders been cleared while midfield runners were penalized, accusations of favoritism would have been inevitable and perhaps justified. Instead, the uniform outcome validates the stewards' reasoning as objective and condition-dependent. The extremely crowded end of the grid affected everyone equally, so the remedy applied equally too. This egalitarian approach to regulatory enforcement is rare in modern Formula One, where nuanced decisions often spark controversy. But here, the physical evidence of congestion was so overwhelming that debate became unnecessary. Carlos Sainz received a warning for driving unnecessarily slowly before turn 13, a completely distinct infringement that had absolutely nothing to do with the safety car line 1 grid stops involving Verstappen and the other 4 drivers. This critical separation matters because early coverage from outlets like Sportbible initially appeared to group the Williams driver with the 5-car investigation, creating a false impression of a 6-driver mass breach. Planet F1 subsequently clarified that Sainz's summons related specifically to managing his outlap delta time after letting another car pass, not to failing to reach the grid under his own power. His case fell under the same Article 12. I umbrella regarding non-compliance with race director instructions, but the underlying behavior and regulatory rationale were entirely different from the congestion-related clearances issued earlier. Delta managed poorly. Warning issued. Case closed. That sequence summarizes a procedural matter rooted in pace management rather than spatial positioning. While the grid stop drivers faced scrutiny for where they stopped, Sainz faced review for how slowly he drove while completing a formation lap requirement. The steward's decision to issue only a warning rather than a sporting penalty reflects the lower severity of this infraction compared to potentially blocking the pit lane or compromising safety during grid formation.